All right, hi everybody. So thank you guys very much for taking some time to watch this webinar. So this one's going to be on how to reuse Revit content to supercharge your BIM infrastructure and standards. So what I really mean about that is project closeout. So you've taken the time as a team to put together a really good project. There's probably a lot of good stuff in there and stuff that we can reuse. So we're going to be talking about how to deal with that. So my name is Michelle Ovelson. I'm the implementation manager with Summit. So I'm just going to get rolling. So just to go over the agenda for what we're going to talk about today. So first I want to talk a little bit about why it's important to look at completed projects. We're going to go through a checklist for what kind of items you want to look for. Now this checklist is going to be customized more to the architectural side, but a lot of this stuff could be customized for structural or MEP just by switching out the content portion. And the last part is how to get these items into your infrastructure. So when I say infrastructure, I mean your template, your warehouse or content management files, and standards and protocols. So just kind of that whole back end side. So first part is why do you need to do them? So this is the best way to keep your infrastructure up to date. So projects are always evolving and changing, and content is changing, ways of doing things are changing. So we want to make sure that if people have taken the time to create these things and they can be used on other projects, that those get up to date and put in somewhere central for other people to use. And this also allows you to, so it's not just about getting stuff out of your model, but it's also about seeing how these models are standing up to your guys' standards and protocols. So we can do a little bit, as you're doing the project closeout, you do a little bit of a comparison at the same time to see, you know, are your naming conventions working? Where there's certain things that was written out as a process, but for this particular project was a struggle to follow. So we also want to make sure that we get that feedback back to your BIM manager or your BIM management team. So the next part is who does them. So ideally, I'd like to see a BIM lead take on this task. It would be a little bit overwhelming and probably not very realistic to have the BIM manager do all the project closeouts for your entire company. So ideally, I would like this to be the BIM lead for a couple of reasons. A, to split up that amount of time. Like I said, the BIM manager is not going to be able to keep up with that, but also because that BIM lead should have the most knowledge about that project. So they know the background of things that had to get added or changed or things that didn't work. So that's really valuable when you're kind of doing this project closeout, because they can compile all that information and that knowledge versus somebody just looking at the model that wasn't involved on the project level. So before you get started, you want to have a checklist to go through and keep your comments organized. So I have an Excel file here that I use, and this is the checklist that I go through. So just gonna kind of walk you through how this is set up here. So up here, I write in the project that this is for. If we've got multiple models or multiple buildings or anything like that, then I'm gonna put in the model that was done and who the BIM lead is on this project. So especially if this gets given to the BIM manager, then they can make sure they know who the lead person was that wrote this. Now down this side here, we have the item that we're looking at. So it starts out with template, and then we have a section for the warehouse or your content management, whatever you're using here. And then we'll have a section at the bottom for process and other. And I'll go through in more detail what some of these items are for. Now in here, I put in an issue. So if there's an issue with that item, then you say yes. If there's not an issue, you say no, and there's nothing that needs to be done from that aspect for the item. So then it just makes it a little more clear to know that, you know, if project browser organization is good, then the BIM manager doesn't even need to worry about it. So we're just fleshing out where the issues are. Now the next column is questions from the BIM lead. So this is the section that the BIM lead is going to fill out. So they're going to go through their model and look at each of these items and write comments for the BIM manager or the BIM team on where there were issues or things that were missing or needed to be changed or things that can be extracted and used again. Now this next column is action required from the BIM team. So this would be where the BIM manager would fill out that, you know, I need to pull this legend from this project and put it in our template because it's good and it can be reused, or it's just kind of so you can see the back and forth. So this is what the BIM lead is looking at the issues, and then this is the correspondence that came from the BIM manager side. And then the last section here is just updated infrastructure. So that's once you guys have gone through the process of reviewing this with the BIM manager, then they have to go in or assign people to go in and update the infrastructure where it was required. So go into the template, make some updates and changes, pull content, get it into the warehouse. So this just is a running record of whether or not it was complete. So if it's black, it's not complete. If it's green, it's good and it's been updated. And then NA just means that there was nothing, no updates that needed to be required. Okay, so have a checklist in place to keep yourself self-organized. You also want to have a new project open that was created from the template file, because you're going to have to compare your project to the templates, especially if you're looking at, you know, schedules that were in the template versus schedules that you had at the end of the project. Then you can tell which ones were added. And if you had things that changed, you can kind of have that comparison. You also want to have the warehouse file open, or have the folders open that lists all the families that are in the warehouse, just something so you again can compare the lists. And you're also going to want to have your standard document or protocols open as well, so that you can compare that as well, because a lot of this is extracting stuff out, but we also want to have in the back of our minds how the standards were holding up and if those need to change as well. So the other thing you want to do is detach a copy of your model. So you are going to be making edits and changes to that model. So you might be adding some views, deleting some stuff, doing a purge. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that to the project model, but we're going to detach a copy and call that our project closeout. And then we can be free to kind of play around in there. So once you do have that detached copy, we are going to want to purge out all the items in the project that were not used. So if it wasn't used, then it's not really something we need to be looking at. So run that purge, and then that's just saves us from pulling stuff out that was never used anyways. Okay, so the first section we're going to look at is template items. So first thing I like to look at is the starting view. So the first question is it being used? So if you can look at the starting view that you would have had at the beginning of your project to the end of the project, has it changed? You know, if your starting view has spots in there for people to be adding information, filling out to-do lists or milestones, anything like that, did anybody do that? If they didn't do that, why did that not happen? So, you know, is there an issue with the starting page? Maybe there's too much information. It was hard for people to read or understand. Maybe the team just didn't know that they were allowed to edit it. You know, try to flesh out, you know, if this is from the BIM lead perspective, maybe if you do see that nothing was really being used in that starting view, go back to your team and ask and find out, was there a reason that things weren't being updated? And as the BIM lead, you should be kind of making sure that this stuff does get up to date. So just from your perspective, was there a reason why you didn't put information in there? Or did you find that there was too much information and stuff was hard to sift through? So that feedback is really important. So then you would go into your project closeout list here and you'd say, you know, yes, there was an issue, and you want to confirm with the BIM manager you felt like there was too much information in that view. It was hard to read and wasn't valuable on a day-to-day basis. So you don't necessarily have to go back with them with a change and a solution. You just have to say, you know, honestly, from my perspective, we didn't find it super helpful, and maybe we can look at a different way to adjust it for other projects. So project browser organization. So when you look at your finished project, were there a lot of views in the question mark section? And if so, you know, is there a problem with that? To me, usually means that there's a problem with the organization. Maybe you're missing headings that were not put in the standard document. Maybe there's issues with people creating new views and not knowing how to get them into the right spot. So you want to kind of flush that out and see if there were just issues with them being organized and where those issues were. And you also want to look at the view types. So I'm a big fan of creating view types for every different view I have. So I'll have a floor plan for roof, floor plan finishes, floor plan furniture. So you can build in view templates and all that jazz and get it to sort itself. But were there view types, if you are using that, were there view types that were missing from the list that you had to create, or were all those view types in that question mark section? So then you want to get that feedback to the BIM manager so that they can update and add any headings or types that weren't accounted for. Okay, so same thing again, you would just go in here. Now in the instance of here, for the example, I said that, you know, there were no issues. So if everything looked great and was working, you just say no, you leave it blank and just put an NA at the end to know that there's nothing to fill out here. So the next part is the legends and the schedules. So you want to compare the list in your project up against what is in the template file. So again, that's why you want to have that project open that's using your template so you can see what it looked like to start with and what it looks like at the end of your project. And then you'll be able to find those differences. And you want to go through those and see, was this a one-off situation, or was it done because somebody didn't understand how to use something properly, or is it something that is missing from your template and should get added? So then you want to make sure that you flag those. So even in your detached copy that you've made as your project closeout, you can either put, you know, rename the schedule. You know, this is something that needs to get looked at. So right up in here, I would just go in and say, you know, rename, add to template. So then what this does is as you are using that, that project closeout file, it's going to allow you to have good notes to refer back to them. So then when you go through this with your BIM manager, you can say, oh, yeah, these are the ones that I think should be added to the template. Or you could put in another one in here that says, wasn't useful. Go in and rename this stuff so that you can kind of classify which ones were good and which ones weren't. Okay, so it's not only just were those legends and schedules there and were they being used, but also was the information up to date. So maybe that was an old building code schedule or building code legend and it needs to be up to date. You know, you find that I'm constantly copying from a previous project. That kind of information is really important to make sure that you relay that back to the BIM management team so that they know that the legend is there, but it needs to be updated. Sheets and title blocks. So if you are using placeholder sheets in your template file, were there any placeholder sheets that were missing from your drawing package that you had to create? Are there any title blocks that were missing from the template that you had to go and find and load back in? Or were there any edits to the title blocks that you guys had to make? So that kind of stuff you want to check and look for. Annotations, so you want to compare your list of annotations in the project up against the one that you're looking at in the template. So a lot of this project browser stuff you're going to be hanging out in the project browser organization because this is the best way to get the lists of stuff. So you can go in here and look at what was done for annotation, look at what was done for families, and compare that up against the list that you had in your template file. Now, there will be a few different ways, and I'll talk about, you know, you can get Dynamo to pull out lists into Excel. A lot of times I'll just do a quick screenshot of my project one that has the template stuff and the one that has my model and just compare the two. A lot of times this stuff will come kind of shining to the forefront because it probably won't be using the right naming convention that you guys use, especially when we get into families that were maybe brought in from online. So that's usually how we're going to start kind of looking and narrowing this stuff down. So you want to find out where they were different. So you also want to remember back or check with your team to think, were there any annotations that were missing or that weren't functioning properly, you know, that weren't working, or you had to create, you know, a quick little dummy tag or something to get it to do what you wanted it to do. Make sure those get brought up as well. So dimensions and textiles. So we want to, again, compare with the template. Were there extra styles in the project? If there were, was this an issue where, you know, people weren't sure what textile they should be using? Maybe the naming convention wasn't clear or the standards weren't readily available to them. Or were there textiles or dimension styles that were missing? And so if there were, then you want to make sure you go in and add into here, you know, we really found it valuable to have this red markup text for our working views. So bring that to the forefront of the team, and then maybe then they'll be able to decide if that's something they want to roll out to everybody. View templates. So this can be a really big task because view templates are used a lot. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of settings. So how do we get this up to date? So again, you want to compare these lists. This might be a good use for a Dynamo script to pull that out and run the comparison. If you don't want to do that, we can, because it's the BIM lead, you can just, you know, try to think back and remember which ones had to be created from scratch, or there was probably somebody on your team that was getting really annoyed with a view template because they had to go and update it and change the settings because it wasn't looking right. So try and collect and find that feedback so that you can relay that back to your BIM management team. Color schemes, you also want to check color schemes in case your team has put together a really good color scheme for design or for area plans that, you know, you find, again, you're creating it all the time, or you're creating it or grabbing it from previous projects. These will usually jump out to the BIM leads because they'll know that they've been grabbing it from other places. Or if something was done and it worked really well, you want to make sure that gets written up in the section here. So that they can look at that too. So filters, kind of the same thing, compare the list. I really like to have my filters documented out into an Excel file that also includes an explanation of their use. So if you do have something like that, you can compare that list with the ones in your project, and then pull out those ones that were useful and can be reused in your template. Okay, so now talking a little bit about content. So I've split this up into system families and loadable families just because it's a different way of being able to get stuff out of the project. So if we're looking at system families, you want to go through the project browser to see your list of types. And again, you're only reviewing the types that aren't in the warehouse file. So a lot of times you can go down into your list here, and if, you know, let's say this was my naming convention, those are all kind of clearly staying in line. So compare this up against the ones that you have in the warehouse file. You know, maybe just take screenshots, compare project browser to browser. Some of the ones that have been created, you'll find generally if people aren't following the naming convention, they will jump out. So again, it's a comment of saying, you know, why didn't you follow the naming convention on this? Was it unclear? Were you unsure? All that stuff. But then after that, you can think of, well, was this wall something that we can reuse? So when going through this, you can right click on it, select all instances, visible in entire project, so you can see, you know, maybe get a count for how many times it was being used, understand where it was being used, go into the type properties and take a look at what was in there. So you can find out all that information and then decide, yeah, this is one that, you know, we're going to be doing a lot of these convenience store projects. So let's take and put this into another file. So the steps for that is a copy and paste types into the warehouse, into another file. So you don't want to, most often the BIM leads aren't going to have access to edit the warehouse, and you might not want that to happen. So the BIM lead's going to want to create a new file where they can bring stuff into there for the team to review and vet. So, and this can just be a faster way to go through the list of content. I mean, you could do the same thing in here where you go in and rename it and say, you know, can we add? And then go through your project file that way. You can also do it where you just select it, copy it and paste it into your separate file, because then what you can have is you'll have just a list. So ideally you'll have this little interim file, but has all the wall types kind of side by side, floor types, any of that stuff that you wanted to pull from there, so that you and the BIM manager can then look at that list or that file together and just go through really quickly to see which ones will be reusable and which ones won't. So you have a couple options there depending on what you want to do. So as you're going through this detached copy for your project closeout, it might also be tempting to go in and delete walls. You're like, oh, this is in the warehouse, I don't need it, delete. But just keep in mind, especially if it's anything like walls that can have stuff that's hosted to it, that could also be deleting content that you want to be reviewing. So I don't recommend removing any of those walls. That's kind of why I like to see it get copy and pasted into a new file, just so you don't mess up any of the other content that you might want to see where it's being used. So loadable families. So if you have a strong process in place for people to save families into a project folder that is specific for that project, then that's really great, and that's definitely something that we encourage. So ideally, as you guys are working on a project, you have a folder in your project folder that is just for families. So anything that's being pulled online or needed to be created goes into there, so that then that chunk of families can be vetted and put into the warehouse file. So that kind of saves the step of having to do this searching. But if you aren't confident that all those families are getting put into that folder, you can just look at the model as well. And this will be a very similar process again, where we're just looking through through family types and seeing which ones don't match the naming convention, all that kind of stuff. Compare them out. This will take a little bit longer, and that's why I do encourage people to use that project folder. But sometimes, there's people that just download them onto their desktop and load them into their projects. So it's not a bad idea to run through this really quickly. So again, if you had the list of even from the families that are in that project folder, if you have that list and you kind of go through just quickly and compare that with the families that are in your project, then you'll be able to kind of grab which ones are new. And so if they are something that is that's new that you want to again look at using, you can just do a right click and save. So if it was missed from the from that folder, that project family folder, you could save it into that project family folder to make sure that they're all there. And then as part of the discussion with the BIM manager, I again would still load those all into this temporary file, because it's a lot easier to have a discussion with the BIM manager about the content that's in that folder if you can see it. So then you can place them, you can look at them in 3D, you can click on them, see what information they have, versus just giving them a file name. That's a little bit harder to vet. So then you guys can go through the list of the families all in this project and say, these are the ones that, from my perspective as the BIM lead, these ones were really useful. And I think given the projects that we're going to have going forward, we'll be able to reuse these again. And then the BIM manager can also look at it from the side of, making sure it aligns with standards, naming convention, all that stuff, and then come to a decision on whether or not they get put in. Okay, so I have down in here the warehouse section, so you can rename this, content management, however you guys are going to do it. And then we'll have the different items in here. So this is where you don't have to list out every single wall or type that you're going to bring in, especially if you're going to have that other container file that's going to be what you and the BIM manager talk about. So you might just say, there's a couple walls that could be added to the warehouse, or there's a railing type that we found would be useful. So when you guys are looking at content from the BIM lead perspective, also think about how these hold up against your standards. So you might have a list of abbreviations written out in a standard protocol for how floors should be named or how walls should be named. And as the BIM lead, if you found, there was a floor type that just didn't suit that naming convention, or there was abbreviations that were missing, make sure you bring that up as well, because then they'll be able to update the standards and make sure that it's a full list of what's required. Okay. Yeah, so with the right click on here, so I just want to make sure too, you can also double click, right click on these guys and see how often they're being used and select all instances and that kind of stuff. And that can be really important too, to just find out where they're being used. You can also go to a 3D view and isolate them using your temporary hide isolate to see those families and kind of where they've been placed. And that can sometimes help just give content text, especially if it's an online family that hasn't been named super very well or clear. So extracting loadable families. So we talked a little bit about this. So if you have a family folder in place, then we'll compare those two against the ones you want to extract. And sometimes you're going to have to make this call based on how much content actually needs to get pulled out of here. So if this is maybe you're kind of newly developing your warehouse and you guys don't have a lot of content yet, you're going to be pulling a ton of content from your project files. So in that case, it might make sense to do to take this file, delete out the families that don't, I'm not saying this for the system families, but for the loadable families, delete the ones that are in your warehouse, and then go and do a file save as library. So what this does is it will save all of your loaded families into a folder for you. So that can be a much quicker way to extract them out versus doing a right-click save. But if you're at the point where you guys have a lot of content that's been developed and it's only a handful of families that you really need to pull, then you can just right-click, do the save this way one at a time, and not have to clear out all the other ones that are existing. So that can just be, that's kind of your call based on how much content is needing to be pulled from that file. Detail items. So how I usually like to do this is to create a new drafting view. So you just go to view, drafting view, and then you go into your detail item section and I just pull them across. So again, I'll be vetting this against the list that's in my warehouse, and any ones that don't look familiar, I'm not sure what they are, I'll pull them across and then take a look at them. If they're ones that I think are good and should be reviewed with a BIM manager, then I'm just gonna copy and paste or transfer that drafting view over into that other file for us to go through together. Groups. So I like to look at groups when I am doing my project closeout as well, because a lot of times people, if there is content that is missing and they don't have time or maybe have the knowledge to create the family themselves, they're going to go to a group. So they're going to create a model group or a detail group for stuff that could be and should be used as families. So, so you're going to want to go down into the model group section and just do the same kind of thing with the other ones. Do a select all instances, entire project, right click, take a look at it. This is again why naming convention for your groups can be really important, because if you have 50 groups that all say group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, it's going to be really hard to tell what groups are actually, maybe suite layouts versus what groups are a splash pad. So if you have a really good naming convention, you could even put a naming convention in place if, people aren't supposed to use model groups as families, but if you can't get people off that train, maybe put a prefix in there, F splash pad, so that all of those get grouped together, and then people with the ability to create those families can then take a look at those groups and make the ones that are required. So again, you'll narrow down which ones have been created as families and then bring them back into that, copy and paste them back into this file over here so that you can take a look to see if that's something that's going to be reused. Detail ones, same kind of thing. You're going to find stuff for detail components. You might even find situations where they've put together a tag that was missing. So that can provide a lot of feedback as well for what you need to use. So I also have a section at the bottom of this. So there's the detail items, then the group stuff, and then I've got one that's called process and other. So this section is a little bit more open-ended, and it's just for things that may be missing, more so related to standards and processes and protocols. So if you were using model groups a whole bunch for this project and you found that you weren't really sure how it should be set up, there wasn't a lot of documentation to support that, and you guys had a lot of questions of how best to do it, then let's put that in here as well as an issue that, you know, we were creating our model this way and we found that there were standards that weren't really, we would like to see more standards in place on how we should set this up. So this is how we did it. And then you can go with the BIM management, talk to the BIM manager and say, this is how we set it up. Is that close to what it should be? And make sure that they can kind of see how it was done and then work towards getting a protocol in place so that future projects can be more consistent. So when I say other, this can be anything else that you found in that project. You know, maybe this is training as well. So you said, you know, as the BIM lead, you had a couple of people that were kind of newish to Revit. They could really use use some training on, you know, family creation because there were a bunch of model groups that were used instead of families, or they had a really hard time with A, B, and C. So it's just something where it's a little more open-ended. You can just put some of the extra issues that didn't have a place up top for the BIM manager team to know about how that project was run. So now if we look at the entire project closeout process, so project closeouts should be done by a BIM lead at the end of every project. So there should be, this is something you're going to have to talk to your, you know, your higher ups about because it's going to take a few hours to go through this. So that lead should have time allotted for them to sit down with that project, spend a couple hours to go through it and vet it and see what can be reused and go through this process. Because that needs to be allowed for. You know, if they go from one project and then immediately get jumped onto another one, this isn't going to happen. And I just don't think it's very realistic to have a BIM manager do all of the project closeouts in an entire office. So we also have to account then once the BIM lead has done that review, then the BIM manager has to also have time to sit down with that lead and go through the results of that and find out, you know, what the updates need to be. All right, so just in conclusion, so just to summarize, your infrastructure is never complete. So there's always going to be new projects, maybe new project typologies, new products, new ways of doing things. So we can't just create the content and the template and think that we're done. There's always going to be things that can be done better. There's going to be new developments with Revit, new features that will change how your template and how your infrastructure can work. So we have to think about how that process is going to work in your office, and you have to allow time to make sure that it's getting up to date, because otherwise you're going to get, once you get it out of date, it's going to take a lot longer than just a few hours per project to get it back up to where it needs to be. So build into the end of a project a few hours for this process to happen. And that might sound like, you know, a few hours of billable time for that lead, and that might be hard to justify, but if you think about the amount of time that people are spending, you know, even if you get 5 families and a better schedule from that project, how much time did that just save X number of projects for people that weren't finding that stuff online, creating it themselves, or asking questions about how to do something? So if you take that time to put that stuff in place, that's time that other people won't have to spend, and you do it once and you get it in the right spot. So it's also very important to get the feedback from your projects. So a lot of times as BIM managers and as BIM committees, you know, we set standards in place and we put protocols in place, do the template, the warehouse, but we also have to make sure that that gets vetted up against the real life projects. So this process is very important to get that feedback from the BIM lead on how our infrastructure is holding up to the real life situation of projects. So it's very important to get that back to the BIM management team. And also this could be something that the BIM lead updates throughout the project as it comes up. So they could have this Excel file with them throughout the project. You know, it's kept in the project folder, and maybe they're updating it as issues come up so that they, instead of having to kind of remember throughout the entire duration of a project, they can say, oh, you know, I had to do this or I had to add this. They have a place to put it. And then once the project is done, then it's not you sitting down. You're still gonna have to sit down for a few hours at the end just to run through everything, but it's not gonna be quite so tedious to go through and remember a year's worth of stuff that happened. So definitely a good idea if they can get into that habit to have a place to put this stuff, and especially in a formatted way. So it's not just a sticky note on your desk. It's a document that you can update and refer to and has spots for the information that you need. Okay, so questions. I'll leave it open for a few minutes if anybody has any questions of things that they would like to know or ask. Oh, here, let me just okay, so one question. Was it mentioned why a startup screen can be useful to have? Oh, like a starting view for your template. I mentioned it a little bit, but I can go through it again. So a starting page, that was back to kind of this first slide here, a starting view. So why I like to see them is because it's usually, it's kind of the message board for the project. So when it comes to starting views that I like to put together, it's usually, it needs to be very clean. So you're gonna just wanna have, you know, maybe the project name. You might wanna have the list of, you know, who the project, the BIM lead is on that project. I like to see some milestones, or maybe, you know, you put on there, this is the next big deadline. And then just like a message board. So anything that's really unique to the project, if you had a very complicated set of design options, I would toss that in there just to say, hey, design options are being used extensively. Please talk to so-and-so about how it's set up before you get started. So anything that, you know, if I'm a new person that just got dragged onto this project, what do I need to know? And it's just, it needs to be quick and it needs to be lean, so that a lot of times you'll see starting views that have a ton of information and it's too hard to read. Good rule of thumb is if you do zoom extents, you should be able to read all the text. And it should be a very quick reference. So yeah, it'll vary from client to client, but that's usually some of the best practices that I like to see. Is there a shortcut to finding model in place families? So you can find them, you can probably find them with like a Dynamo script. I'm not sure if there's ever been something that really jumps out as in place other than the numbering. So how I usually find them is if you go to a schedule of all your content, you're gonna see something that says desk 1, desk 2, desk 3, desk 4, desk 5. If you see like sequential numbers all with the same family name, there is a like 97% chance that that's an in-place family. That's usually what I use as kind of a flag, because it's not necessarily about if they're using an in-place family. You know, if it's a one-off thing that had validity for it being in place, then that's fine. Where it becomes a problem is when they take in-place families and you copy them 20 or 30 times. So I find, without doing anything complicated, just looking at a schedule of families will give you a very quick rundown if they're being used where they shouldn't be. Will you be sharing a copy of your checklist as an example of your protocol? Yes, so if anybody is interested in getting a copy of the Excel file, you can get in touch with us. So I'll show my email on the last slide here. So you can definitely give us a call or send us an email, and we can, yeah, then we can send you it. So would running through the project closeout review form be useful to run through and update at each transition of project phase, showing some form of checkpoint throughout the project life, i.e. end of schematic, end of design, end of construction? Okay, I see what you're saying here. Yeah, absolutely. It would be, I think that would be great if you could build that into your process to do. So I do something it's project closeout, but it's also, I do something also called model audits. So I usually do model audits during the duration of the project where we're looking for similar things. We're not extracting out content, but we're more so looking at our processes being followed. Is there training that needs to be required? Is this project, you know, going down the right path? So it could be a combination of that. And if you did want to extract content, I'm just not sure it would make sense to extract it that often, but it could be a combination of a model audit and maybe using this checklist for certain things that you did want to pull out on a more regular basis. It's just that balance of doing those reviews and those checks with the time that you have as well. So I think a combination of those two would be really great. And I think that's it for questions. So if anybody has anything else, you can definitely toss it in here. If not, you can email us. So my email is on this last slide here, michelle@summitaec.com. So you can follow us on Twitter. This webinar will be posted to our YouTube channel. So that's YouTube Summit AEC. And we'll post it on our BIM blog as well. So like I said, if you guys have any questions after this webinar or want to get in touch, feel free to email us or give us a call, and yeah, we can go through those. So thank you guys very much for taking some time out to attend this, and yeah, I hope you guys had a great time and learned something in the process. So thanks a lot.